Good morning. My name is Father Jim Clarke. I'm a resident here at St. Anthony's Church, and I'm the Director of New Evangelization of the Archdiocese. It's my pleasure to be with you and to talk to you about what does it mean to connect to the real Jesus. There's a cute story told about two 7-year-old boys who've been training to receive their first communion. And it turns out that these two were the two most difficult, or should we say, rambunctious boys in the class. And so the teacher decided that during the First Communion service that she would sit behind them. And thankfully, the entire Mass, they were perfect until it came to communion. They both went up very reverently with their hands folded, eyes downcast, received the Eucharist and came back to their place. And they obediently knelt down. And then one boy leaned over the next guy, and she was about ready to say, "That's enough," when she heard the boy say, "Do you feel different?" And the other boy said, "Yeah, do you?" He said, "Yeah, me too." Beautiful story that illustrates the opportunity, the possibility, and for many people the experience of encountering Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. What I'd like to do in these two different videos is to offer you an expanded version of understanding more deeply the great mystery, the great gift, the great responsibility of the Eucharist. So let me begin with the Scriptures. In John chapter 6, verse 53, we read something truly engaging, powerful, deep, mysterious, that can be understood at many different levels. Jesus says, "I solemnly assure you, if you do not eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in me." During this Easter season, we are reading a lot of the Gospel of John. This is considered truly a mystical gospel, which very simply means that the way that we read the Scriptures can invite us into ever-deepening areas of understanding and application of the mysteries of what Jesus is speaking and sharing with his followers. So we might say it this way: there are stages of appreciation of the mystery, of learning how to find the extraordinary in the ordinary. Isn't it interesting that Jesus left us a sacred meal? He could have left us any number of things. He could have left us a sacred philosophy. He could have left us, a very unpacked, rolled out, wonderful new theology. He could have left us with any number of external objects. Instead, he left us with a powerful symbol of a meal. What might this mean for us? Well, this is why St. Augustine, Doctor of the Church, said that the domestic Eucharist is sharing a meal together at home. To recognize the communion, the coming together in community, sharing nourishment, this solemn focus of there's something more here than just food and drink. This is what Jesus is speaking about in this Gospel of John. So I'm going to start with a very basic question for you. Who is God for you? For many people, God doesn't have a name. For other people, they've got lots of names for God. For some people, they say, well, God is up there, meaning the transcendence of God, or God is beyond us. Some people speak about God is within everyone and everything. So we'd call an immanence of God. All of these are correct, but there's still only a partial understanding of what God is about, because God is perfect mystery. We can never fully comprehend who God is. Another way for us as Catholics is we speak about the diaphanous experience of God. This is God through creation, through human beings. So here are some other ways of looking at God. Remember that God is not a subject. God is not a person per se as we understand that in the 21st century. Rather, God is pure energy. God is pure presence, what we call an intimate presence. That God is mysterious and complete. And that's why the Church reminds us we always approach God with deep respect and deep humility. Another word we can say is that God is about connection. This is why Jesus gave us Eucharist, because Eucharist is about connection. We cannot celebrate Eucharist alone. We need community, even if it's a community of two, to recognize that the coming together we are experiencing God's divine presence. And you know that. And that's why I want to offer you these two videos, because this is a perfect time for us to really reflect on, to pray, and to meditate upon this great mystery. So, let me give you something to chew on. All sacraments, all of our sacraments flow into and out of the Eucharist. Into and out of the Eucharist. The Eucharist was the primary worship experience of the early Christian community. They knew this intimately. They did not fully understand what today we'd call the theology or even the philosophy or a deeper perspective of Eucharist. They just knew it by their experience. They could see the fruits of it. And this is why Sunday Eucharist was the most important day of the week for them. Now, mind you, daily Eucharist did not come into the church until the 5th century. It was the weekly celebration, because it was a way of reminding the early church that this great mystery of the Eucharist needed to be not just chewed on, not just drank, but also meditated on, reflected on, discussed, and experienced. And so a week was given to the early faith communities to prayerfully discuss, to reflect on, to grow in the Eucharistic mystery. So what this might say to us is that there is meaning in all events. There is meaning in all things. There is meaning in all relationships. A very Catholic concept. But here's the key. As St. Paul reminds us, it is life as participation. That's the invitation. It is not that Jesus did everything for us. Rather, he said, come, follow me. He wants us to experience the mystery of our own life, just as he experienced the mystery of being fully human. Wow. So, like Jesus, there are times we need to be truly active in that participation in our life. Truly active in our participation of worship of God, of understanding and living out the mystery of the Eucharist. And there are other times, like Jesus, where we passively look, we passively admire, reflect on. Both are a work of the Spirit. Both are necessarily important for every Christian believer. I bring this up because it is a deep, important Catholic concept that we are a both-and religion. So, we say, as I said earlier, that God is not only transcendent but immanent. God is also through this energetic presence that we call love. We also speak about the Eucharist being a sacrifice and a meal, Jesus being human and divine. We also speak about the Eucharist being word and sacrament. So here, as you can see in this video, we have the sacramental presence, the Eucharistic presence of Jesus. We also have the Word of God, the immanent presence of God's divine gift to us. And this interchange between Word and Sacrament, we are teased into reflecting upon the sacrament and the Word of our own life. This is what we call in theology the wisdom of paradox, that we are to hold both and, again with humility and respect, sometimes not fully comprehending what's going on. Think of the early Christians. They did not fully comprehend what's going on. Their eyes had to be awakened. Their heart had to be softened and gentled. Their life experience was touched as they began to see and to experience the risen Christ in a different way. So this gift that Jesus gave us was a gift that tapped into the ancient understanding of human beings, that human beings yearn for stories, much more than explanations, that ancient peoples honored their life experience and recreated new life experiences through ritual expression. And Jesus' deep wisdom, his own Jewish faith, his experience of Abba, helped him to take something very human and say, here it is. Here it is, story and ritual. And so we honor that. So let me share with you a bit of history, and if you'd walk with me through this history, and I admit this is a quick summary, but I want to put it in perspective as we talk a little bit more about Eucharistic devotion. You see, Eucharistic devotion, as we know it today, had begun in the first century, but in a very small way. It did not reach its full flowering until the 14th century. It appears had to have begun in the Diocese of Paris, around the year 1200, when the priests in that diocese, bit by bit, began to pause during the imposition of the gift and the transformation of the species into the body and blood of Christ. And they would hold up the host and hold up the chalice for a bit longer than usual. And so slowly, the people began to truly look forward to that. Because now remember, by this time, the people did not understand the language the priests were using, which was Latin, of course. The vast majority of the uneducated mass were lay people. It primarily was the clergy and the university professors and those involved in the academic realm that understood the language. So they were left to use their imagination to begin to focus on the beautiful artwork, the architecture, and the prayers that the clergy would teach them. And so they began to get this wonderful attraction of being able to see the Eucharist. So there was an oracular, a visual connection with Eucharist. This began to unfold in Eucharistic processions that flowed out of the celebration or honoring the solemnity, the feast of Corpus Christi. So we recognize this focus of seeing, or we use the word venerating the Eucharist, began to be affirmed by the clergy and by bishops as they granted indulgences for being present to see the Eucharist. Slowly, this focus began to evolve where they came up with the idea of putting the host in an instrument called the monstrance, which was developed from the use of the reliquaries. And these would be the instruments that held the sacred relics of the saints. Therefore, when the priest would put out the monstrance, he could leave it there for an hour or longer, and people would come, and they would come to worship the Eucharistic Christ. This particular experience began to evolve into benediction. During Mass, the ringing of bells was again calling to mind to all the faithful if they were distracted. But pay attention, the host is being raised. The chalice is being raised. So this moment was magnified when the host was held in the monstrance. And interesting enough, there were many benefits that many of the people began to share. Miracles would take place because they had viewed the Eucharist. And in a strange way, as human beings would be, very often many of the farmers would bring some of their animals, especially if they were sick, and they'd hold them up, hoping, looking forward to that maybe they could be healed. Or their sick children, same principle. Eventually, this Eucharistic veneration began to evolve where there was veneration of the Eucharistic Christ in the tabernacle. So both were operating in a parallel dynamic. So this is what we'd call a passive devotion, a looking at, an observing, a celebrating, a recognizing that there's something special. But here is the interesting thing. It was not a sacrament, because a sacrament, as you know from the very traditional definition, is an encounter with the Lord, you see? And so it's more than just sitting passively. So let me say it this way. A devotion is much more about a focus on the transcendence of God, or the transcendence of the presence of the divine. So it's a heartfelt. So we have the word devotion. It's a heartfelt connection, which I personally believe that every human being needs to have that devotion to something beyond them, to extend, to expand, and to deepen them. But devotions tend to lead towards and to ground people in a passive way. A Eucharistic spirituality is very different. Eucharistic spirituality is meant to work together with one's devotion. It's an active response. It is lived out in one's behavior. Now here's the key. The Church hopes that in our devotional practices and in our spiritualities, that we would use our intellect to join the two together and to see they belong. Why? It's the same principle as why when we celebrate the Eucharist, the very last words that you will hear is when the deacon or the priest says, the Eucharist is ended. Let us go forth and glorify the Lord by our lives. Or let us go forth and live and share the good news of Christ. Because Eucharist is about worship and service. It can easily become very personalistic if I just focus on I'm going to church. I'm going to receive my Eucharist. You see? The service reminds us, as Jesus sent out his own apostles, that no, it's both. It's both individual and collective. In the 15th century, there began to be a bit of overcompensation and stronger focus on the Eucharistic species in just looking. So much so, the laity began to refrain from receiving the Eucharist. Because after all, wow, if I just look at the Eucharist, my friend got healed, this happened, so I don't need to receive. So the lessening of going to confession, the lessening of making a point of receiving the Eucharist, you can imagine where this went. Well, Nicholas of Cusa, who was the papal legate to Germany in the 15th century, also a philosopher and theologian, said, the Eucharist was instituted as food, not as an item on display. Great summary of the theology of the Church. This is important for us to remember because the Church then, because so many people weren't following this wisdom, had to move towards a council saying, listen, at the very minimum, to be a faithful Catholic, you need to receive communion at least once a year. You need to go to confession at least once a year. That tells you how bad it got. Now, it is true that saints invariably had their own private devotions because these devotions grounded them in a heartfelt relationship with the Lord and with many other saints, as well as our Blessed Lady. But these same saints often spoke about this was the foundation for them moving beyond or seeking out or growing in the mystical, or we might call the authentic religious experience of connecting with God. This is extremely important. It's extremely important because they didn't stop at the comfort station of their favorite devotions. And my friends, you know as I do, we all have our favorite devotions. And yet, that's not where we're meant to stop. When Jesus said, come follow me, he meant that personally and collectively. That we are to go where the Spirit of Jesus leads us. And it's always beyond that. Let me give you an example. I grew up with a charismatic devotion. Been involved in charismatic renewal since 1970. That has really fostered and helped me to mature in the spiritual life. But I began to recognize that something was missing. And thankfully, by the grace of God, I was called to the seminary to study, to pray, and reflect on the great mysteries. And eventually I was ordained a priest. I've spent my whole adult life meditating on these mysteries. And I recognize that my learning and my training didn't in any way take away my deep yearning to worship God and my devotion. It's deepened it. And I've come to recognize and to know that what's more important if I am to mature as a human being, as a man of faith, is I have to put into practice what these devotions are all about. And that is an intimate, ongoing encounter with Jesus Christ and with the fullness of their Spirit. So what might a Eucharistic spirituality look like? I'm going to give it to you in 4 words. A Eucharistic spirituality is about being taken, being blessed, being broken, and being given. This is why, whether it's through the Word or through the sacrament, we are to remember these 4 words. So Lectio Divina is a way of working with, unpacking, reflecting on, applying the Scriptures to our life, applying the stories that we hear at every Eucharistic celebration. So we are to allow ourselves to be taken in by the Word, to chew it, as the first century monks talked about. We are to allow it to bless us. And here's the tough one, to break us open, to allow us to see and to come and to know God in a whole different way. And finally, to give ourselves over to this message and live that message with others. Again, the 4 words are taken, blessed, broken, and given. And of course, the same as in the Eucharistic species, that the bread is broken, the grapes are crushed, they are taken and they are blessed, and they are broken open and transformed and given to us as food, nourishment. This is why you hear in so many documents and so much preaching that we are a Eucharistic people. We are Eucharistic people. So I'd like to conclude with a very interesting video that I saw when I was getting my degree for pastoral counseling. And it's one that perhaps you've heard of. It's a very famous one, but it's one that obviously has stuck with me. It was produced by a man named Daniel Simons, and it's about the study of cognition. In this particular short video, there are 2 teams of 3 persons each, and they are wearing, respectively, black and white shirts. Each team is engaged in passing a basketball among themselves. Now, the viewer is given the instructions that they are to count the number of times that the ball is passed between participants. Now, the white balls are being passed, and a person dressed in a gorilla costume then walks to the middle, stops, beats his chest, screams, and then walks off. Now the viewer is then asked, at the end of this particular demonstration, how many times the ball was passed. Okay, and of course, people will give different answers. But then the second question is, how many of you saw the gorilla that came into the room? And I remember with my classmates, we looked at each other and said, there's no gorilla. And the professor smiled and said, let me play it again. He played it again, and it was so shocking to us. Sure enough, there was a man dressed in a gorilla suit that came into the middle, beat his chest, let out a roar, and just continued on. Now, why was this experiment so important? To demonstrate something that we may not know as human beings. We only see what we intend to see, what we believe to be there. This is why police officers don't just interview a single witness. Because we all see what we want to see. That is affected by our belief system. In the Talmud, a very famous Jewish commentary, it's very clear. We see things not as they are, but as we are. This is so very, very important. Stay tuned for the second video as we unpack what a Eucharistic spirituality looks like. God bless you.